Let's go to Mr. Land, the land of magic. Come on and see Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 14, Mr. Forgetful.
It really is a pantomime.
It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep. Mr. Forgetful. He was having a dream. Then the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. He yawned and stretched his arms and tried to remember what he had been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't, because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face. But he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. And do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. Then he went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread, but of course he forgot about it and it was burnt. He boiled himself an egg, but of course he forgot about it, and it was hard-boiled. Mr. Forgetful has burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. It was such a lovely day, Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down to the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago, but had forgotten to post. Off he set. And did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind him? Of course he didn't. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Mrs. Parcel in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? I'd like... I've forgotten, he said. A stamp? Suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp, that's what it was I was trying to remember not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do, but could he remember what it was he was supposed to remember not to forget to shop for? Of course he couldn't. So he decided to go home. On his way, he met the village policeman going the other way. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said the policeman. Would you give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please? Farmer Fields had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He never had a message to deliver in his life before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself, trying to remember the message as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. 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 Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over to himself. There's a sheep loose in the lane. Eventually, he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. Mr. Fields, he said, there's a goose asleep in the rain. Mr. Fields couldn't believe his ears. There's a goose asleep in the rain, repeated Farmer Fields slowly. But I don't have any geese, and anyway, it isn't raining. Are you sure that was the message? Poor Mr. Forgetful. He got it all wrong, and he couldn't remember how to get it all right. He simply couldn't remember it all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Fields' farm, feeling very sorry for himself. I wish I could remember things, he thought. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into it and fell over. Bother, said Mr. Forgetful. Bah, said the sheep. How silly letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. And then he remembered the message. He jumped up and ran back along the lane to the farm as fast as he could. Mr. Fields! Mr. Fields! He called as he ran into the farmyard. Mr. Fields, there's a goose asleep in the rain. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Fields scratched his head. Come with me. Come on, cried Mr. Forgetful, and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. There it is, cried Mr. Forgetful, panting. Ha! Ha! A goose! And then he stopped. Oh dear, he said. That's not a goose, is it? That's a sheep. And he blushed. I think, smiled Farmer Fields, that you're the goose. And he chuckled. And Mr. Forgetful giggled. And Farmer Fields laughed. And even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day it had been. But do you know something? He tried and tried, but try as he would, he simply couldn't remember anything that had happened. Ah, Mr. Forgetful.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 15, Mr. Jelly.
It really is a pantomime.
Poor Mr. Jelly was frightened of everything and anything. At the slightest little thing he would quiver and tremble and shake and turn to jelly. So it's not really surprising to find that Mr. Jelly lives as far away from everybody as possible. In the middle of a wood, miles and miles from anywhere. The story begins one morning when Mr. Jelly was asleep. It was a beautiful autumn morning. The sun was shining, the leaves on the trees had turned to a glorious red, and the wind stirred gently in the treetops. A single leaf fell gently from the tree right outside Mr. Jelly's house, and quietly brushed against his bedroom window as it fell. Mr. Jelly woke with a start. "What's that terrible noise?" he cried. "Oh, heavens! The house is falling down! Oh, disaster! It's an earthquake! Oh, calamity! It's the end of the world!" And he hid under the bedclothes, trembling with fright. After an hour, by which time he realized that his house wasn't falling down, and there wasn't an earthquake, and the world wasn't coming to an end, Mr. Jelly peeped out from under the bedclothes. "Phew!" he said. "Thank goodness for that!" And he got up, went downstairs to make his breakfast. Mr. Jelly poured some cornflakes out of a packet into a bowl. Then he poured some milk onto the cornflakes. Then he went to the cupboard to get some sugar. Crackle, crackle, went the cornflakes in the milk. "Oh, goodness gracious!" cried Mr. Jelly, diving under the kitchen table. Oh dear! I hear guns! Oh, calamity! Oh, it's war!" But of course it wasn't. And of course, Mr. Jelly eventually came out from under the table and ate up all his cornflakes. After breakfast, Mr. Jelly thought that he would go for a walk. He was walking through the woods which surround his house, when a worm poked his head out of the ground. "Morning," said the worm cheerfully to Mr. Jelly. Mr. Jelly nearly jumped out of his skin. "What?" he shouted. "Who's there?" And then he saw the worm. Oh, good heavens! It's a snake! Oh dear! It's a man-eating snake! Oh, calamity! I'm going to be eaten alive! And he jumped up into a tree. "What a performance!" commented the worm, and went back into his hole. After an hour, Mr. Jelly felt brave enough to climb down from the tree and continue his walk. Eventually, he came out of the other side of the wood and into a field. Mr. Jelly glanced nervously around. It was an empty field. Or was it? In the long grass in the middle of the field, unseen by Mr. Jelly, there was a tramp enjoying a sleep in the autumn sunshine. Mr. Jelly picked his way cautiously through the grass. The tramp, fast asleep, snored. "What was that?" shrieked Mr. Jelly. "It's a lion! I heard a growl! Oh, goodness gracious! Oh, dear me, a lion! A huge lion! With enormous teeth! A huge lion with sharp teeth that's going to bite me in two! A huge ferocious lion with enormous sharp teeth that's going to bite me in two if not three!" And he fainted. All this commotion awakened the tramp, who yawned, stretched, sat up, and saw Mr. Jelly lying on the ground beside him. "Oh dear," he said, for he was a kindly tramp. "Oh dear, and he picked up Mr. Jelly and placed him gently on the palm of his hand. Mr. Jelly came to and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Then he saw the tramp's face looking at him. "Oh, disaster!" he screamed. "Oh, calamity! It's a giant, an ogre! Oh, gracious, he's going to have me for breakfast!" My, said the tramp gently. "You're a nervous little chap, aren't you? What's your name?" "Mr. Jelly," stammered Mr. Jelly. "I used to be nervous like you," said the tramp, "but I learned how not to be. Would you like me to tell you the secret?" Mr. Jelly quivered and shook his head. "Yes, please." "It's very simple," continued the tramp. "All you have to do is count up to 10, and you'll find that whatever's frightening you isn't quite so frightening after all." Then he set Mr. Jelly gently down on the grass. "Remember," he said to Mr. Jelly, "count to 10. And off he went. Mr. Jelly thought that it would be a very good idea if we went home immediately. Back across the field he went. Back for the woods he went. He was walking through the woods when he stepped on a little twig. Snap! Went the twig. Mr. Jelly jumped twice his own height in terror. "Oh, what was that?" he shrieked. "Oh, that terrible snapping noise! It's a tree falling down that's going to crush me to pieces! Oh, calamity! It's a crocodile hiding in the bushes, snapping his teeth! Oh, disaster!" And then he stopped. He took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, he said. And then he saw that what had gone snap was a twig. A silly old twig. "Phew," he said. Mr. Jelly had almost reached his house when a leaf drifted gently down from a tree on top of him. "No, police murder!" he screamed. "I'm being kidnapped! Oh, calamity! It's ruffians with guns! Oh, they're going to..." And then he stopped. He took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then he saw that what had fallen on him was only a leaf. Nothing but a leaf. A stupid red leaf. "It works!" he said out loud in wonderment. And you know, it did work. After that moment, Mr. Jelly became a changed man. Well, you can see that by looking at him, can't you? He never shrieks or shouts or screams or quivers or shakes or trembles anymore. And he never hides under the bedclothes anymore. Well, not very often anyway.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 16, Mr. Noisy.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading the story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then, Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, 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 clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash! Went the door as he opened it. Bang! Went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, 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 clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street.
We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy,
she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what?
I know,
said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy went shopping again. Clump, 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 clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed.
Sorry, what did you say?
Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted.
Sorry,
said Mrs. Crumb.
Can you speak up, please?
I'd like loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy.
Can't hear you,
replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed, hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed.
A what?
Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. Loaf! And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said, quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled.
Certainly,
she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice. I said I'd like cut. And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So, carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home, up the hill. Clump, 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 clump. Then he stopped, and then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped. And then he thought. And then, do you know what he did? He opened the door, very quietly. He stepped inside. And then he shut the door. very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That was fun too. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 17, Mr. Lazy.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Lazy lives in Sleepyland, which is a very lazy-looking and sleepy-like place. The birds in Sleepyland fly so slowly they sometimes fall out of the sky. The grass takes so long to grow, it only needs cutting once a year. Even the trees are lazy-looking and sleepy-like. And do you know what time everybody gets up in Sleepyland? The answer is, they don't get up in the morning. They get up in the afternoon. And incidentally, this is what a Sleepyland clock looks like. Everything takes so long to do, there's only time for 4 hours a day. Anyway, this story starts with Mr. Lazy being fast asleep in bed. In Sleepyland, they call that being slow asleep. He spends rather a lot of time in bed. It's his favorite place to be. He opened his eyes, yawned again, and went back to sleep. Later, Mr. Lazy opened his eyes again, yawned again, and went back to sleep again. Much later, Mr. Lazy got up and went to make his breakfast. We say breakfast, although really it was tea time. He put the kettle on to make some tea. Kettles take 2 hours to boil in Sleepyland. Then he toasted a slice of bread. Bread takes 3 hours to go brown in Sleepyland. Toast never gets burnt there. While he was waiting for his kettle to boil and his bread to toast, Mr. Lazy went into the garden of Yawn Cottage, which is where he lived. He sat down on a chair, and you can probably guess what happened next. That's right. He yawned, and yawned again, and went to sleep. Suddenly, he woke up with a jump, which is something that doesn't happen very often to Mr. Lazy, and the reason he woke up with a jump was because of the noise. "Wake up!" said the noise. "Wake up, wake up, wake up!" There were two men standing in front of him. "I'm Mr. Busy," said one of the men. "And I'm Mr. Bustle," said the other. "Come along now," said Mr. Bustle busily. "Can't have you sleeping all day," added Mr. Busy, bustling Mr. Lazy to his feet. "But who are you?" asked Mr. Lazy. "Well, Bustle and Busy," they replied. "Oh," said Mr. Lazy. "Come along now," said Mr. Busy. "We haven't got all day." "But," said Mr. Lazy. "No time for buts," said Mr. Busy. "Or ifs," added Mr. Bustle. "There's the wood to chop, and the beds to make, and the floors to clean, and the coal to get, and the windows to polish, and the plates to wash, and the furniture to dust, and the grass to cut, and the hedges to clip, and the food to cook, and the clothes to mend," added Mr. Busy. "Oh dear," groaned Mr. Lazy in a doze. "The wood to clean, and the beds to get, and the floors to cut, and the coal to cook, and the windows to make, and the plates to mend, and the furniture to chop, and the grass to wash, and the hedges to dust, and the clothes to clip." He got it all completely wrong, he was in such a daze. Then Bustle and Busy set Mr. Lazy to work. Chopping and making and cleaning and getting and polishing and washing and dusting and cutting and clipping and cooking and mending, not to mention all the fetching and carrying. Poor Mr. Lazy. "Now," they said when he'd finished, "it's time for a walk." And off they set, on the longest walk Mr. Lazy had ever been on. Mr. Lazy is one of those people who never walks when he has a chance of sitting down, and never sits down when he has a chance of laying down. But this day, he had no choice. They made him walk for miles and miles and miles until he felt his legs must be worn right down to his body. Poor Mr. Lazy. When they arrived back at Yawn Cottage, Mr. Busy said, "Right, now for a run." "Oh no," groaned Mr. Lazy. "When I blow this whistle," said Mr. Bustle, producing a whistle, "you've got to start running. As fast as you can," added Mr. Busy. Mr. Lazy groaned a deep groan and closed his eyes. Mr. Bustle put the whistle to his lips. "Whee!" whistled the whistle. "Whee!" went the whistle. Mr. Lazy, poor Mr. Lazy, started to run, but his legs weren't getting him anywhere. He opened his eyes and looked down to see why. And the reason his legs weren't getting him anywhere was because he was sitting down on a chair in the garden. And there was no sign of Mr. Busy and Mr. Bustle. It had all been a terrible dream. And the whistle was the whistling kettle boiling in the kitchen. Mr. Lazy heaved a sigh of relief. And then he went into the kitchen and sat down to have his breakfast and to think about his dream. But you know what happened next, don't you? "Wake up, Mr. Lazy! Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up!"
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 18, Mr. Funny.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Funny lived in a teapot. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, and it suited Mr. Funny very nicely. One day, Mr. Funny was having lunch. He wasn't very hungry, so he only had a daisy sandwich and a glass of toast. "Delicious," he murmured to himself as he finished his funny lunch. After lunch, Mr. Funny decided to go for a drive in his car. Mr. Funny's car was a shoe. Have you ever seen a car that looks like a shoe? Looks very funny. As he drove along, everybody who saw him laughed to see such a funny sight. He passed a worm at the side of the road. The worm thought Mr. Funny and his funny car was the funniest thing he had ever seen. He nearly laughed himself in two. He passed a pig in a field. The pig thought Mr. Funny and his funny car was the funniest thing she had ever seen. She nearly laughed her tail off. Even the flowers he passed thought that Mr. Funny was the funniest thing they had ever seen. They nearly laughed themselves out of the ground. Eventually, Mr. Funny came to some crossroads. He didn't know which way to go, so he looked at the signpost. One of the signs said, "To the zoo." "That'll be fun," thought Mr. Funny to himself. So he drove his shoe towards the zoo. When he arrived at the gate of the zoo, he stopped. It was closed. "I'm sorry," said the zookeeper. "We had to close the zoo because all the animals have colds, and they're all feeling very sorry for themselves." "Oh dear," said Mr. Funny, and then he thought, "Perhaps I can help to cheer them up," he said. "Well," said the zookeeper, "it's worth a try." And he opened the gate. Mr. Funny drove into the zoo in his shoe. The first thing he saw was an elephant. It was true. The elephant was feeling very sorry for herself, very sorry indeed. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking elephant. And the sad-looking elephant stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh dear. Then, do you know what Mr. Funny did? He pulled a funny face. Mr. Funny, as you'd imagine, is very good at pulling funny faces. The elephant giggled. She'd never seen anything so funny. Mr. Funny pulled another funny face. The elephant burst out laughing. The elephant laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard, she nearly laughed her trunk off. And she felt a lot better. Mr. Funny went over to the lion house. There was a lion, feeling extraordinarily sorry for himself. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking lion. And the sad-looking lion stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh dear. And then Mr. Funny pulled the funniest looking face that's probably ever been pulled anywhere. Ever. Now, you've heard a lion roar before, haven't you? Well, this lion roared too, with laughter. He laughed so hard, he laughed his whiskers to pieces. Then Mr. Funny went around to see all the other animals in the zoo. Oh dear, what a miserable looking lot. For all of them, Mr. Funny pulled funnier and funnier faces. The big brown bear giggled and then burst out laughing. And the giraffe laughed so hard she nearly laughed her neck into a knot. And the hippopotamus nearly laughed himself out of his skin. And the penguins nearly laughed their flippers floppy. And the leopard, well, you really should have seen him. He laughed so hard he nearly laughed his spots off. Oh, what pandemonium! Oh, Mr. Funny, giggled the zookeeper, who had started laughing as well. Oh, Mr. Funny, thank you very, very much indeed for coming to cheer us all up. Oh, it was nothing really, replied Mr. Funny modestly, and drove off. In his shoe. Later, when Mr. Funny arrived home, he chuckled to himself. Well, he said, that's the end of another funny day. And he parked his shoe and went inside his teapot. And because he was feeling thirsty, he made himself a nice hot cup of cake.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. Sea, all the Mr. Men, the men who live there. It's Mr.
Book 19, Mr. Mean.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Mean lived up to his name. He lived in what could have been a nice house, but wasn't. He never painted it, or mended the windows, or repaired the roof. Inside it was the same. No carpets, no curtains, no pictures, no fires. And Mr. Mean was so mean, he made his furniture out of old orange boxes, and then complained about the price of nails. Why, he was so mean, do you know what he gave his brother for Christmas last year? A piece of coal! It wasn't as if Mr. Mean didn't have any money. Oh no, he had lots of money, and he kept it all hidden in a box which he kept in the kitchen. Every evening he'd sit there counting it. It was the only thing Mr. Mean liked doing. But would he spend it? Oh dear me, no. Not old Meanie. Not if he could help it. One day, Mr. Mean was sitting in his gloomy kitchen, having a gloomy meal. He only ever had one meal a day, and that day he was having a cup of water and a piece of bread which was 3 weeks old. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. Drat, he said, because he didn't like people. Dratted bother. He opened the door, and there, on his doorstep, stood a wizard. A rather fat wizard. Hello, said the wizard. I wonder if, by any chance, as it's such a warm day, could you possibly, if it's not too much trouble, be so kind as to, if it's not too much inconvenient, perhaps, as I'm very thirsty, provide me with, what do you think, a glass, if it's not too much to ask, of water, please? He was a very wordy wizard. No, replied Mr. Mean rudely, and shut the door in his face, and went back into his kitchen to finish his meagre meal. But there, standing in front of him, was the wizard. How did you get in? Gasped Mr. Mean. Well, replied the wizard, it was by, how shall I put it, I just, well, you know, waved the old, what's the name, magic wand, don't you know, and well, here I am, if you know what I mean. You must be very poor, he remarked kindly, looking around. Oh yes, I am, lied Mr. Mean. Then perhaps I can help you, said the wizard, pulling up a box to sit down on. The box didn't move, so the wizard pulled it harder, and this time it did move. In fact, it tipped up and spilled all Mr. Mean's money all over the floor. Well, 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 exclaimed the wizard, eyeing the money rolling all over the kitchen floor. Well, 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 well. It would appear to me, he continued, that you, sir, are an old meanie. Mr. Mean didn't hear him. He was too busy scraping all over the floor trying to pick up his money. "And mean ears," added the wizard, "need to be taught a lesson." So saying, he waved his magic wand. All the money turned into potatoes. Potatoes! Poor Mr. Mean. Oh dear me," he wailed. "Please turn my money back into money. Oh, please, please, please," he begged. "Perhaps," replied the wizard. "But on the other hand, taking all things into account, by and large, things being what they are on the face of it, perhaps not. However," continued the wordy wizard, "if you make me a solemn promise never to be mean again, then I will turn your money back into money. But," he added sternly, "if you are ever mean again, then it's, how can I put it, then it's potatoes for you, my lad, if not other vegetables as well." Then the wizard had the glass of water he came for in the first place, except that it was a cup of water because Mr. Mean didn't have any glasses. Then, with another wave of his wand, he turned the potatoes back into money, and, with another wave of his wand, made himself disappear. "Stupid wizard," murmured Mr. Mean, picking up all his money. The following day, Mr. Mean decided to walk into town. He never took the bus because that cost money. On the way, he met an old washerwoman carrying an enormous bundle of washing. "Please, kind sir," she asked, "could you possibly help me to carry this washing? It's so heavy." "No," replied Mr. Mean. "It's your washing. You carry it." But, as soon as he said that, he felt a tingling in his nose. Mr. Mean's nose turned into a carrot. "Oh, no!" he gasped. The old washerwoman chuckled, and then Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Yes, he cried in a panic. "Of course I'll help you." And he carried the huge bundle of washing to where the old washerwoman wanted, and the carrot turned back into a nose, and off he went. The old washerwoman chuckled again, and turned back into the wizard. It had been him all along. On his way into town, Mr. Mean passed by a cottage garden. In the garden, there was an old man chopping wood. He saw Mr. Mean going past and called out. "Excuse me," he called. "Could you give an old man a bit of a hand, young fellow me lad?" "No," replied Mr. Mean. "It's your wood. You chop it." But, as soon as the words had passed his lips, guess what happened? His ears turned into tomatoes. "Oh, no!" he gasped. The old man chuckled, and Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Yes, he cried. "Of course I'll give you a hand." And he chopped and chopped until all the wood was cut, and the tomatoes turned back into ears, and off he went. The old man chuckled again, and turned back into the wizard. He was teaching Mr. Mean a lesson, just as he promised. Eventually, Mr. Mean arrived in the town. There was a little boy crying because his ball had got stuck on top of a wall. "Please, sir," cried the boy. "Please, sir, could you reach my ball down for me?" "No," retorted Mr. Mean. "It's your ball. You—" And then he stopped. There was a funny tingling feeling in his feet. Yes, he said hurriedly. "Of course I will." And he reached up and passed the ball to the boy and went on his way, looking anxiously at his feet. The little boy stopped crying and turned into the wizard. "I think," he said to himself, "I think that Mr. Mean, by and large, is beginning, if I'm not very much mistaken, to not be quite so mean, and I think, although I could be wrong, although I never am, that he has, thank goodness, learnt his lesson." Today, Mr. Mean's nothing like so mean as he used to be. He doesn't keep his money in a box in the kitchen anymore. He spent it all on having his house mended and painted and made spick and span. And he's turned into quite a generous sort of a fellow. Goodness, he's so generous. Do you know what he gave his brother last Christmas? 2 pieces of coal! Wait.
Mr. Fields and Mr. Trees, Mr. Birds and Mr. Bees, Mr. See all the Mr. Men, the
20, Mr. Chatterbox.
It really is a pantomime.
Mr. Chatterbox was one of those people who simply couldn't stop talking. He used to talk to anybody and everybody about anything and everything, going on and on and on, and on and on and on, and on and on and on. And when he didn't have anybody else to talk to, he used to talk to himself. "Good morning, Mr. Chatterbox," he used to say to himself. "And good morning to you," he used to reply to himself. "Nice day, isn't it? Why, yes it is for the time of year." And so on and so on and on and on. He lived in a box-shaped house in a village. Chatterbox Cottage. One morning, the postman arrived with a letter for him. "Morning, Mr. Chatterbox," said the postman. "Ah, good morning to you, postman," replied Mr. Chatterbox. "Although, as I was saying to myself only yesterday, or was it the day before, I forget. However, it's not quite so good a morning in my opinion, but I might be wrong, although not very often as it was the other day. Monday, I think it was, or perhaps it was Tuesday, but never mind, because it is quite a good morning, don't you agree? Yes, of course you do, because that's what you said to me in the first place." And he went on, all morning, and the poor postman was late delivering all his letters. That afternoon, Mr. Chatterbox went into the hat shop in the village. "Hello, Mr. Bowler," he said to the man who owned the hat shop. "Don't you think if it's possible that I could buy, if it's not too expensive, but I'm sure it won't be, a new hat, because, won't you believe it? Yes, of course you would, but anyway, as I was saying, my present hat, the one on my head, as you can see, is getting, how can I put it, a little too old, because I've had it for, let me see now, it must be, let me think, 10 years, no, I tell a lie, it can't be that long, or can it? Well, yes, it could be, but on the other hand," he went on all afternoon, and half the night, long after poor Mr. Bowler should have shut up shop and gone home. Eventually, when Mr. Bowler managed to get a word in edgeways, or was it sideways, he promised to order a new hat for Mr. Chatterbox. Then he pushed Mr. Chatterbox out of his shop, still talking of course, and went home for his supper, which was cold of course, because Mrs. Bowler had cooked it for him hours ago. And while he ate, he thought. Exactly 1 week later, the new hat for Mr. Chatterbox arrived in a smart red hat box. The postman delivered it to Mr. Bowler's shop. "At last," said Mr. Bowler, heaving a sigh of relief. "I think this hat is going to be the answer to the problem of Mr. Chatterbox talking too much." "Oh, I wish it could be," said the postman. "But how can it?" "Because," replied Mr. Bowler, "this hat is a magic hat." Oh, replied the postman, who didn't quite understand. That same afternoon, Mr. Bowler took the new hat round to Chatterbox Cottage. "Oh, goody," said Mr. Chatterbox, seizing the box hat and opening it. "It's my new hat, my lovely new hat. I couldn't wait for it to arrive. In fact, I got up early this morning because Aunt I said that today would be the day. I don't know how I knew, but I knew, and it is, and here's my hat, and oh, isn't it beautiful? I can't wait to try it on. Oh, I do hope it suits me. Do you think it will? Yes, of course you do, and—" "Why don't you try it on?" said Mr. Bowler, grinning. "Try it on? Yes, of course I must try it on. How silly of me to stand here chattering on when I haven't tried it on yet. Yes, I will. Absolutely, definitely. Try it on straight away because, as I said, it's silly just to talk about trying it on and then not trying it on, isn't it?" And so he took the hat out of the hat box and put it on. It was a beautiful hat. "I say," he said, "I must say, yes, I really must, that this hat, yes, it really is, to say the least, one of the better hats I have ever seen in my life. And in this life, I must say, I have seen some hats, and furthermore—" But while he was talking, a funny thing was happening. The more words that came out of Mr. Chatterbox's mouth, the larger his hat became. The more Mr. Chatterbox talked, the more the hat grew and grew. Mr. Chatterbox kept on talking, and the hat kept on growing. "I can't see anything," he said. "1 minute I was standing here admiring my new hat, and now, all of a sudden, without any warning, taking me off unawares, just like that." The hat grew down to his feet, and Mr. Chatterbox stopped talking. And as soon as he stopped talking, the hat grew smaller and smaller, until it was the same size as when he first tried it on. Mr. Bowler had gone when Mr. Chatterbox couldn't see him, and now he was walking back to his shop. "My special magic hat really works," he chuckled. The following day, Mr. Chatterbox was out for a walk when he met the postman in the village. "Hello, postman," he said. "I say, do you like my new hat? Have you ever seen such a fine hat? I'm sure you never have. What a hat!" But you know what was happening, don't you? The hat grew and grew and grew the more Mr. Chatterbox talked. "Now I know what Mr. Bowler meant by a magic hat," chuckled the postman, and he went on his way, leaving poor Mr. Chatterbox speechless. He thought, thinking, not talking, thinking. And you know something? That hat taught Mr. Chatterbox his lesson. And these days, he doesn't talk half as much as he used to, or even a quarter as much. And you know the reason for that, don't you? Yes, of course you do. But keep it under your hat.